Hey there, and welcome to Dr. Pete's channel on the essentials of pathophysiology and pharmacology. I have a particular session for us, and this will be dedicated just on how drugs work. So it's a short session on describing how pharmaceutical drugs perform their actions in the body. So if we're going to have a look at this, then first up, I'll break it down into smaller parts. So I want to share my screen over here. And so when we look at, for example, how drugs work, then we're really looking at the principles of drug action. And when we look at the principles of drug action, then we start asking ourselves about the mechanism of action of a drug, or the drug mechanism. Some particular textbooks call this the MOA, or the mechanism of action of a drug. So when we consider that, then when we can then consider four particular targets that all drugs generally work on. All right, so there's four particular targets in the body that all different drugs will work on. So they'll work on maybe just one target. Some drugs might work on two, but most drugs just work on one particular target. So I'll give you an overview of what those four molecular targets are in the body. Now, how I'm going to do that is I'm going to move over to my document camera and give you a one-page summary coming up right now. So there's my little trusty document camera, and away we go. And let's have a look at this. So all of this comes under the banner, of course, of pharmacology. And there are two general branches of pharmacology. I might just dim that down there like that. So there's two general branches. One is called the pharmacodynamics, and the other branch of pharmacology, guess what the other branch is? Pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics. All right. Now, this branch here, pharmacodynamics, that actually begins to talk about, for example, what the drug does to the body. So this pharmacodynamics is all about what the drug, so what the drug does to the body. All right. So with this, we've really got to consider, for example, then, what is, for example, then the mechanism of action of a drug if we're going to understand what the drug does to the body. So in that instance, you need to then consider what is the molecular target in which a particular drug will move towards and enable its actions to happen in the body. So this is the four molecular targets that I mentioned earlier. So what are these four molecular targets that drugs act on? Well, you know what? One of them, check this out, one of them is a transport protein. So a transport protein. Now, a transport protein, if I was to, for example, draw a cell in the body, just one cell in the body. Let's say I drew a cuboidal cell. There it is there, and there's the nucleus in the middle, all right? And then, you know, for instance, there might be a particular special integrated protein that is embedded in the cell membrane. So this is the cell membrane, and this particular structure here, which is it's a protein, an integral protein that's embedded in the membrane, that could be described as a transport protein. Now, there are, for example, different transport proteins on cells in our body. And for example, there are ones that can they uptake a particular substance, like, for example, norepinephrine, Ne. So this is a transport protein that takes up norepinephrine into the cell. So now that means, for example, there might be drugs out there, well, there are drugs out there that are known as tricyclic, TCAs, tricyclic antidepressant drugs. And what these tricyclics do is they actually, the way they work is they inhibit the uptake. They inhibit the uptake of norepinephrine. So how they do that is these drugs is they act on the transport protein and they inhibit the uptake of norepinephrine into the cell. And so that's how they work to change the function of neurons inside our brain. So that's one particular mechanism of action. The molecular target is a transport protein, and the example I gave is tricyclic antidepressant drugs, which inhibit the uptake of norepinephrine. So that's just one example. What about then another example? Well, there is another example of, for example, is the ion channels. So there are also in cells of our body, there are channels called ion channels. So for example, if I drew a cuboidal cell, there it is there again, the cuboidal cell, there's the nucleus in the middle, all right? There's the membrane. Now, what ends up happening is we also have special channels that these channels, what they do is they will enable, for example, certain ions to come into the cell. So ions are either positively charged or negatively charged molecules that can come into the cell and change the function of the cell. And, when we're talking about this in the body, then when we're talking about a lot of cells, we're talking about tissues, for example, and by certain drugs can actually act on all of these ion channels in tissues of the body and change the function of those tissues. So I'll give you an example of that. There is a particular ion in our body called calcium ion, Ca++. This is calcium ion. And there are channels in the membranes of our cells known as calcium channels. And so these calcium channels enable Ca++ to come into the cell, and that changes the function of the cell. Now, in a working example, there are drugs called calcium channel blockers. Now, what these drugs do, these calcium channel blockers, is they come along and they act right there on the calcium channel, and they actually block and they prevent calcium coming into the cell. And that can actually change the function of the cell. Let's say this cell was a smooth muscle cell in our body. Instead of a cuboidal cell, it's a smooth muscle cell. And, that relies on calcium to come in and function properly. However, calcium channel blockers, what they do is they bind to the calcium channel and they prevent calcium ions coming in. And that means that the smooth muscle is unable to contract like it normally does. So calcium channel blockers can do that as one example. Calcium channel blockers are also used. There are calcium channels also on nerve cells in our body as well, of course. So there's an example of ion channels. Again, that is a molecular target for certain drugs like calcium channel blockers to act on and influence or inhibit the input or the entry of calcium ions into the cell. So that's another example of a mechanism of action and a molecular target for certain drugs like calcium channel blockers. All right, there is now another example. So what is the other example of a molecular target in our body? Well, there are on the surface of our cells, quite often there are these structures called receptors. And so again, I'll draw a cuboidal cell, and there's the nucleus in the middle again, and there's the membrane. And what we have on the surface of this particular cell is this structure here, which is known as a receptor. So that is a receptor. And what it does, it's actually perfectly structured to receive a particular, for example, ligand, this square structure. If it was a particular molecule or a drug, it would fit perfectly in that slot there and bind to this receptor. So how do receptors work? Often they are, for example, G-coupled receptors. And what they do is they enable a particular substance to bind to the receptor and change the function of the cell intracellularly. So, for example, let me think of one. There is one, for example, again, we can think of a particular type of receptor up here. That receptor there could be known as a beta receptor. Now, beta receptors, those type of receptors, they can actually perfectly accept the substance adrenaline, or commonly we can call that also in the body norepinephrine, NE. So that means, for example, there are receptors on the surface of our cells that are beta receptors, and what they do is they accept norepinephrine to bind in there and cause an effect. However, there is, for example, a class of drugs, and they are known as, for example, beta blockers. Beta blockers. And what they do is the drug will come along. So this is a beta blocker drug, and it will take up that spot in there, inside the on the surface of the receptor, and it takes up that spot. The beta blocker drug does, and it prevents norepinephrine from binding to the beta receptor because it's taken up by a drug known as a beta blocker. So there you have another example of a mechanism of action of a particular drug. These are called beta blocker classes of drugs, beta blockers, and their molecular target is the beta receptor on the surface of cells. And what that does is the beta blockers is they prevent norepinephrine from binding to the beta receptor and causing an effect. So quite often, for example, norepinephrine can cause the heart rate to go up and the blood pressure to go up. However, a beta blocker, it takes up that spot and it prevents and blocks the norepinephrine from normally binding in there. And so it can lower the person's heart rate and it can lower a person's blood pressure. Beta blockers drugs can do that. All right, next, what do we have next is the fourth type of molecular target. Now, the fourth type of molecular target is an enzyme. So check this out. So enzymes, there are, hundreds of thousands of different enzymes in our body. And there are, for example, a site in which different drugs can act on different enzymes, a particular site on the enzyme that drugs can act on and influence the function of enzymes. So this can be, again, another example of a molecular target certain enzymes can be molecular target for certain drugs. So I'll give you an example. Here we have, let's say, again, a cuboidal cell. There's the nucleus in the middle. There's the nucleus in the middle, and there's the membrane. Now, when, for example, a cell becomes damaged, let's say that cell membrane become damaged, then what we have is the release of a substance called arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid, by the way, it what it does is it is eventually converted into these substances called prostaglandins. And prostaglandins, what they do is they can actually cause inflammation in the body. So what I'm saying here is that when a cell membranes become damaged and they release arachidonic acid, then that arachidonic acid is converted into prostaglandins, and that leads to causing inflammation in the body, which is a redness and swelling in the area that has become damaged. Now, there is a particular enzyme that acts in here, and it's a very special enzyme, and the name of that enzyme is called cyclooxygenase. And this is an enzyme because it ends in A's, and what it does is it accelerates the conversion of arachidonic acid into prostaglandins. Now, it's very interesting here because there is a class of drugs called NSAIDs, which are known as non-steroidal NS anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs. Now, it's very interesting because NSAIDs, how they do is they act as COX inhibitors. All right, COX inhibitors. So that means, for example, what NSAIDs do is they come in and they bind to the cyclooxygenase enzyme and they prevent its proper functioning. And that means that arachidonic acid is not overly converted into prostaglandins, and less inflammation occurs when this particular enzyme is inhibited by the NSAIDs, which act as COX inhibitors. So there you have another example of a molecular target that drugs can work on, which is the enzymes in our body. So in summary, what we have here is now the 4 drug molecular targets. What are they? They are transport proteins, they are ion channels, they are receptors, and they are enzymes. So I hope you enjoyed the summary for this on the principles of drug action and the ways in which drugs work, the drug mechanism, by acting on these 4 drug molecular targets in the body. So if you like that, don't forget to subscribe and to hit the like button. I'll put up some more videos later on. Bye for now.